are so many different elements that are happening in the United States of America. We have had the coronavirus pandemic, we've had the riots, we've had political turmoil and intrigue. We've had the greatest divisions that we have seen in many, many years. I would surmise that probably not since the 1960s have we seen this level of division, and especially when it comes to the presidency. I mean, now we literally have Democrats who are consistently saying that President Trump is an authoritarian who is shredding the Constitution, constantly violating it. In fact, we can go back to December of 2019 when Nancy Pelosi, and we have this in Cut 8, when Nancy Pelosi said that she was proceeding with articles of impeachment against President Donald J. Trump. Let's go ahead and roll Cut 8, please, Mr. Matoush.
The president's actions have seriously violated the Constitution, especially when he says and acts upon the belief. Article 2 says I can do whatever I want. No, his wrongdoing strikes at the very heart of our Constitution, a separation of powers, 3 co-equal branches, each a check and balance on the other. A republic, if we can keep it, said Benjamin Franklin. Our democracy is what is at stake. The president leaves us no choice but to act because he is trying to corrupt, once again, the election for his own benefit.
Now, those words from Nancy Pelosi are the very first quote in the book authored by our next John guest here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Professor John Yoo is the Emanuel S. Heller Professor of Law at Berkeley Law, UCLA Berkeley, and is co-faculty director of the Korea Law Center and director of Public Law and Policy Program there, and also author of the new book, Defender-in-Chief, Donald Trump's Fight for Presidential Power. And Professor Yoo joins us now here on the program. Welcome to the show, sir. It's good to have you.
Oh, thanks, Jimmy. It's great to be with you. Thanks for inviting me.
I appreciate the opportunity. You have a very fascinating new book that delves into President Trump in a way that a lot of people haven't looked at him. You have Democrats. We just played the clip. You begin your book by quoting Nancy Pelosi in December of 2019 as she was moving forward with articles of impeachment. And that's a very interesting passage that kind of helps set the tone for even this year, because all we're hearing about is the authoritarianism of President Donald Trump and how he has vastly expanded presidential authority. Just kind of give us a sense, and we'll put your book up on the screen here, of what your the new book, Defender-in-Chief, is about and why you began with that quote from Pelosi.
The book itself is a systematic look at President Trump and his constitutional positions and his constitutional battles. And the reason I started this way was back in 2016, I was wary of President Trump. I thought he was a populist, and populists like Andrew Jackson or FDR are the ones who usually want to burst the bounds of the Constitution to achieve their mandate. But what I found over the years, and more recently, even as you're saying this year, when you refer to the Portland and city disturbances, that it's President Trump's critics who have been the main people who have wanted to overturn institutions, rip up constitutional standards, and overthrow the meaning that we have used to operate our politics for the last sometimes 200 years.
I think it is such a profound point that we have. First of all, I find it interesting when the Democrats bring up the Constitution. I just have to be honest with you, because so far astray have they brought us from the Constitution in so many different ways. But one of the areas we're hitting on here, and this is the subject of the book, is presidential authority, because we're consistently hearing that President Trump is overstepping his bounds. But your book explores this from a number of different angles. Overall, what's your assessment of how President Trump has approached the presidency?
Well, he wants to try to restore political control over this, as you point out, this gigantic government, mostly created by progressive presidents. And you can see a lot of the battles I try to talk about as a fight between President Trump trying to restore that original Spartan limited government of our founders, and to fight against this modern, sprawling, unaccountable bureaucracy. So, take, for example, the Russia collusion investigation. We're still learning more about how that got started and how groundless it was. But one way to think of that is right, under the 18th century Constitution, President Trump is the head of the executive branch. He's the only one constitutionally responsible for law enforcement. Everyone who works for him, prosecutors, the attorney general, everyone, is a subordinate, is his assistant to achieve that job. And we hold them accountable through picking the president. Think about what Jim Comey wanted to do as head of the FBI. He said, basically, I get to decide who's fit or not fit to hold the office of president because I'm part of this government that's separate, that's technical, scientific, professional, that should be insulated from political control. And so I think a lot of the fights you're seeing, you look at the constitutional level, what it is trying to restore democratic control over our government, and the government trying to stop that with the Russia collusion investigation, the Mueller investigation, impeachment. These are all like revolts by the bureaucracy against the people, the president that the people chose to elect and put in charge of.
Again, we're talking with John Yoo, who is professor of law at Berkeley Law, and he's author of the brand new book. Let's put it up on the screen again. Defender in Chief, Donald Trump's Fight for Presidential Power. And I want to play another clip, but then we're going to get to some specific elements of the Trump presidency that you discuss in your book, Defender in Chief, Professor Yoo. I want to get to cut 7 here. This is Mehdi Hasan over on MSNBC, and he was talking this week about how we have to start using the word fascism in describing the administration of President Trump. Let's take a look at this.
I've worked around the globe. I've interviewed prime ministers and government officials, dictators, despots, authoritarians. And I think it's time in America that we finally have a proper conversation about the F word. No, not that one. Fascism. I know, it's really controversial. People get very uncomfortable when you mention it. But to borrow a line, if not now, when? And if not us, the free press, then who? For far too long, we have shied away from saying the F word. For a lot of people, calling Donald Trump a fascist was just ad hominem, a lazy political insult. It was the liberal who cried wolf. And yet, look what happened the moment he took office. There was the Muslim ban, and the very fine people in Charlottesville, and then the kids he threw into cages and camps. But it's not stopped. Those were not isolated incidents. Just last month, the president had protesters, as well as reporters, outside the White House, tear-gassed and beaten, so that he could go for a stroll and have a photo op holding a Bible outside a nearby church. And we were told not to call that
Mehdi Hasan
fascism.
Essentially saying there, he's saying it's time to talk about the word fascism when it comes to President Trump. No more setting that aside. He lists the Muslim ban and Charlottesville comments and kids in cages and gassing protesters outside the White House so that he can get a photo op. This is the narrative that is being presented about President Trump right now, is that he is a fascist and that he is doing whatever he can to become an increasingly authoritarian figure. In this moment, especially, Professor John Yoo, how do you view those ideas coming from the left that President Trump is a fascist and he's just trying to become a wannabe dictator to the point of becoming a dictator in full?
Yeah, sadly, this is yet another example of the dynamic I'm talking about in the book about how the left is the one that's gone to such extremes because of their hatred of Donald Trump that they're using the most outrageous language, that they're the ones who are really trying to upend the constitutional order. So take, for example, just the one that you were showing about the rioting in our cities. The president and the federal government have had an authority to protect federal buildings, personnel. Right? They have the authority to enforce federal law, whether that's the drug laws, the gun laws, interstate conspiracies. They even have the right to protect the civil rights of the people that maybe the city mayors aren't protecting, who are living there in fear of violence. This is not some power Donald Trump made up. This is a power that President Washington used at the very beginning. This is, remember the claim that President Lincoln made at the start of the Civil War. That's all he was doing with Fort Sumter, he said. And it's the people who are claiming this is an occupying army or this is fascism, they're the ones who I think are responsible for the extreme nature and polarization of our political debate today. I find it irresponsible.
Yeah, I think that throwing around words like fascism, he was making it seem like we finally reached the moment where fascism is a necessary term for us to use. I mean, that's the mentality here that they're trying to present. But fundamentally, what we're talking about here is across the country, and what President Trump is responding to is the loss of individual liberty by thugs who are rampaging in these cities, in city after city after city. I mean, I'm here broadcasting from Aurora, Colorado. Denver and Aurora, Colorado are now in the thick of this with violence of our own. Of course, Seattle and Portland are hot button locations that people are focusing on. But what you have in these cities is a failure of local governments and state governments to protect individual liberty, property rights, to protect the safety of the people in those locations. And what President Trump isn't doing, though, is just taking on the authority of enforcing all of these laws in local communities. He is particularly trying to protect federal property and even getting intense pushback from that. And yet, he's the one person in some of these cities who's actually trying to enforce the law to the extent he can.
Yeah, in fact, one thing I think would have surprised the founders, the idea that a city or a state refuses to maintain public safety, refuses to maintain public health. Under the Constitution, cities and localities have the primary responsibility for policing, for safety and health. I don't think the founders could have imagined what we're seeing in Portland and Seattle and some of our other cities where the mayors just say they refuse to do it. In fact, I thought I saw the mayor of Portland was one of the protesters who was protesting in front of the federal courthouse. In those kinds of situations, then the federal government has to step in. The federal government has not just to protect its own facilities and not just to enforce federal law, criminal laws, but they're the constitutional rights of the people who live there. And if the city and states default on their responsibility to protect those lives and property, then there is a role for the federal government to do that instead in the most extreme situations.
Let's talk for a moment about Attorney General Bill Barr. He was testifying this week before Congress once again. This time he was being grilled by the House of Representatives for his defense of President Trump's policies and actions, and particularly in dealing with the riot crisis that we have spreading across the country. And basically, you have a lot of people, Professor John Yoo, who are saying that Attorney General Barr is just doing President Trump's dirty work. In essence, he's not abiding by the law or caring about the law. He's just trying to do whatever President Trump feels he needs, almost like a personal lawyer for the president. How do you assess the role that Attorney General Bill Barr has taken upon himself in this Trump administration and his relationship with President Trump vis-a-vis this important topic of your book on the presidency and its role?
I think Bill Barr's been the most valuable player in this cabinet. I mean, he's done a remarkable job. And what he's trying to do, again, as part of this bigger understanding of the Trump presidency I set forth in my book, is they are trying to restore elected democratic control over the great bureaucracy in charge of law enforcement. He is trying to get to the bottom of the Russia collusion investigation, because what that represented, I think he's quite right when he describes it this way, what that represented was this group of unaccountable officials, Jim Comey on who knows who else it involved, who thought that they could use the powers of the government to deny the results of the 2016 election, to do extraordinary things like spy on the campaign of a major political party for president, and to continue doing it after that person won the election and was president. And the problem, the real constitutional threat in all this is that we're going to have some kind of bodies in government that are not accountable to the people, not accountable to the people we send to Washington, whom we elect, who think that they have the power to decide who gets to hold office and who gets to exercise power on our behalf. That is not the system the founders wanted. And I think Barr is doing a really good job taking a lot of arrows in that effort to restore that political elected control over our government.
One of the things that's been pretty striking to me is the fact that President Trump, and this shifting gears to a very different area of conversation, but one of the things that President Trump has done remarkably is reduce the regulatory burden and try to cut back as best as he can to reverse many of the previous policies, previous administrations that have grown government authority to dramatic levels. And even working with Congress multiple times with the Congressional Review Act to go ahead and slash regulations permanently that had been on the books, so they couldn't just be reversed by the next president who could say, hey, let's just re-implement this regulation that we had in place before. It was the first time that we'd really seen a concerted effort by Congress working with the president, and he's done a heck of a lot in terms of trying to rein in some of the excesses of the administrative state in ways that I find pretty impressive. To the author of Defender in Chief, I'm curious what you think about that, especially in the context of the role under the Constitution of the executive branch and the lawmaking process.
It's a great question, and I know it's a great question. I wrote a whole chapter about this, and like you, I think it's one of the unheralded successes of the administration because it kind of happens beneath, beneath the surface of this vast government. But one thing that the administration has been doing, one thing I think that really had a lot to do with the way the economy was just booming until the pandemic hit, was that it was lifting all these burdensome regulations on American business. It was cutting red tape. It wasn't just tax cuts. So the tax cuts are important, but they create this deregulatory push created a lot more stability so that businesses could invest and innovate and hire, and that they didn't think that they would get sued or the rules would change on them or that the federal government would come after them. Because the American economy is so entrepreneurial and innovative, and the worst thing that's happening to it these days is that it's being stifled by its own government. And then a second part of that is that the president, that is also not just a power of the president, as you say, to issue executive orders, but it's also a limit because anything a president does on his own can be reversed by the next president. And I talk a little bit about that when it comes to immigration and the executive orders of President Obama and the Deferred Action for Children program. And that, I think, is also an important part of President Trump there trying to use his constitutional powers to undo what President Obama did, which I thought was unconstitutional, saying I'm not going to enforce the law as to millions of aliens, and try to force Congress to do its job, because really immigration law is up to Congress. And if there's supposed to be a DACA program or program for their parents, which many people in the country support, that's fine, but it's got to be passed by Congress.
And that, I think, as much as the economic benefit of the deregulatory effort of the Trump administration has been so important, the economic benefits are tremendous, especially right now while we're dealing with the pandemic, but it was one of the big reasons why the economy was so robust prior to coronavirus hitting. But that's the more critical point, which is reining in one area where the presidency has amassed greater authority than it should. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court has been giving it a deference in many circumstances here, when the lawmaking power is in the hands of the United States Congress.
Yes, in fact, this is the remarkable thing. I think President Trump came into office, used his executive power to say, I'm putting an end to this unconstitutional DACA program, and I'm asking Congress to pass legislation. He wanted to work out a deal on DACA. He actually has said he supports some kind of deferred program for these so-called dreamers. And then the Supreme Court just a few weeks ago, I couldn't believe the decision it issued. That Chief Justice John Roberts joined with 4 liberal justices to say, no, President Trump has to keep enforcing DACA, even though President Trump thinks it's unconstitutional, even though lower courts have struck down DACA as unconstitutional. Still, you have to keep doing it until you use this burdensome administrative procedure process that can take anywhere from 1 to 3 years. That I does incredible. And so one thing I've argued in the book, and I've argued in the media since, is, well, if that's true, then the Supreme Court might have set back President Trump in the short term, but they just handed over a large amount of presidential power to him, because why does it have to be limited to DACA? President Trump could really reorient the immigration laws. It doesn't have to be even in immigration. He could really do a lot with different other policies, including tax, including criminal law. It could go on. Behind it is this idea, I think some of his critics have, is, oh, there's a constitutional law and presidential power that every other president gets to enjoy. But then there's a different kind of law, different kind of power that limits President Trump only. And That can't be right.
Two quick final questions for you, Professor John Yoo, our guest from Berkeley Law, professor there. The Trump judiciary, you have a chapter on the Trump judiciary, which is a rather interesting thing, especially when we look at two layers. One is what he has done with the lower courts, reshaping. Even the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals is pretty remarkable to see it turning increasingly more in a conservative or constitutionalist sort of direction, even looking at originalism or textualism. So you have that layer on the lower courts, so the appeals courts and the lower federal bench. But then you also have the interesting dynamics that have played out in the Supreme Court of the United States. I mean, we see some interesting decisions from a couple of from the two Trump appointees, but especially now with John Roberts becoming the swing vote, there are some dynamics in play there that are quite fascinating. But talk to us a little bit about what you see as the president, as in President Trump, specifically his role in the judiciary and restoring the constitutional order of government here.
Yeah, so we can be unhappy with maybe one or two decisions that Neil Gorsuch or Brett Kavanaugh, who are the Trump justices on the Supreme Court, have made. But on the whole, they have been very conservative justices concerned with the text and the history of the Constitution. They don't believe their mission is to create new kinds of morals and norms for the rest of the country that aren't in the Constitution and are better left up for Congress and the states. And so, on the other hand, the effect has been that Chief Justice John Roberts, appointed by President Bush, has moved to the middle, and he has voted several times now with the Clinton and Obama justices to strike down President Trump's positions. And that's really a new change. Meanwhile, Justice Thomas, you've got there, and Justice Alito have joined, I think, on most cases with Gorsuch and Kavanaugh to form the conservative wing of the court. But Chief Justice John Roberts has become the swing justice, and it's hard to say the court is reliably conservative unless Trump were to win re-election and have the opportunity to pick a sixth justice. And then I quite agree with you. Also, the unnoticed story, I'm glad you mentioned it, is what's been going on in the lower courts. Trump has picked dozens upon dozens of court judges to the courts of appeal, and he has appointed an all-star team. When you look at the biographies of these young men and women who are ranging in these from about late 30s to early 50s, he has picked an all-star team. He has picked people who are young, aggressive, intelligent, and committed to constitutional principles. And it's important not just because that's where 99% of the cases end up in the lower courts, but it's also that's the farm team, that's the bench that will produce the next set of Supreme Court justices. So I think that could be President Trump's longest lasting legacy in terms of the Constitution, in addition to fighting to protect the presidency.
I would think so, particularly because he could be fighting to protect the presidency. The next president could do things differently. Congress can do things differently, but it will take a long time for Democrats to reshape the judiciary anew back in that direction that they were headed in, which was, I would say, in a direction away from the Constitution and certainly the original intent of our nation's founding document. Now, I'm curious, Professor John Yoo, is our final topic here before we let you go. And I really appreciate your time. It's a fascinating book, again, Defender in Chief. When we look at the Defense Production Act, when we look at what President Trump has done on trade, oftentimes in executive orders in terms of tariffs and what have you, in a variety of different areas where Congress has empowered the president to do different things that some may say, hey, that's too much power going into the presidency, but hey, he's got it at least presented to him because of Congress. He's not just taking it upon himself unilaterally and creating a new role. That raises this question, which is to what extent in some of those areas of criticism where conservatives like myself may say, hey, I don't think you should use this policy or take that particular step, even though it's authorized by Congress, to what extent is it that, something where the Congress has authorized the president to do certain things versus the president himself saying, hey, I'm going to go ahead and take this initiative and create something new out of whole cloth. And by the president, I mean President Trump.
Yeah, Jimmy, that's a great question, because a lot of the things that President Trump has been attacked for, some of the things he was being called a fascist for, these are actually cases where Congress had the original power, and they've given it to presidents, and they gave it to presidents long ago. And many other presidents have used that same power too. It's only when Trump uses the power that suddenly fascism has emerged. So, to give you a great example, the travel ban. President Trump doesn't have the power over immigration. It's in Congress. But Congress gave the president the right to cut off travel from one country or another for national security reasons. Of course, that was a huge battle. And President Trump's view was ultimately vindicated only by 5-4 vote on the Supreme Court. Now no one questions it. Nobody's raising doubts about it when President Trump cut off travel with China when the pandemic broke out. Because everyone recognizes, of course, really the president had that power. Same thing with the border wall. Other presidents have this authority. President Trump has it too, to declare a national emergency. And once he does at the border, he has the right to move money around from, say, military-based spending to building a wall. Again, that's not the president's constitutional power just to build things as he sees fit. He needs to get congressional permission, and he needs to get congressional money from Congress. Again, Congress gave him that authority. He didn't seize it on his own.
This is the thing that's frustrating to me, because in some of these instances, I don't think the president should have this kind of authority, but he does, because Congress, in many of these cases, as you're pointing out, and we're discussing here, Professor John Yoo, he's been given that authority by Congress. But the problem is that so much of the discussion now has been about, oh, President Trump is just going too far. He's gone into the direction of a fascist. Not Congress should rein in presidential authority in these particular areas and restore its ability to make laws relative to these things, and that it should be the central decision maker in these particular areas as opposed to the president. I think we're having the wrong discussion in so many different instances.
No, actually, it's a great point, and what you're talking about is, in the law, it's got this fancy name. It's called the non-delegation doctrine. Mm-hmm. And the question really is there a limit on how far Congress can go in handing off power to the president? And in a way, you could say all those delegations, all those transfers of power are not really in keeping with the original design of the Constitution, where the founders thought that the president on the one hand and the Congress on the other would be jealous in guarding their powers and would be using them to constantly fight. And that constant conflict between the two branches would be what would really keep the government limited and protect all of our individual liberties. What they didn't foresee was that Congress would actually rush sometimes to give these powers over because Congress doesn't want to take hard votes on controversial, difficult questions.
They want to wash their hands of the issue.
Exactly. And that was even before the pandemic.
And then complain when the president does it and not say, hey, we need the authority back.
Exactly. The political scientists say that's how modern Congresses get reelected. They give the president all the hard decisions. They don't want to take those votes. They just want to bring water projects back home. And then when the president decides it, they can criticize him no matter what he does. So, the courts have been careful. The Trump judges have actually really upper in the Supreme Court and the lower courts have been pushing the idea that there's got to be a limit to that. There's got to be a stop put to that. And the other thing, and this goes again to the beginning of the interview about presidential power, President Trump has actually been trying to deregulate. And when you think about deregulation, it is an effort to stop using all of those powers that Congress has been handing off to make the government smaller and more modest, rather than, as you rightly say, past presidents have just rushed to use as much of that power as possible. And so maybe that's what, if you think about what would happen in a Trump second term, what the agenda might be, you might say that would be the complete agenda then, would be to try to really restore political control over the bureaucracy, stop it from attacking our elected leaders, and trying to slim it down and return back to a more modest Spartan government.
Well, I know, Professor Yoo, that you once clerked for Justice Clarence Thomas, and what I would love to see is a Supreme Court full of Clarence Thomases, because then maybe we'd get a little bit closer to the original intent of the framers of the United States Constitution. Let's put the book up on the screen once more. Defender-in-Chief, Donald Trump's Fight for Presidential Power. The author, Professor John Yoo, Emmanuel S. Heller, Professor of Law at Berkeley Law. Such a treat to have you on. I hope you'll come back. This was a very fascinating discussion and a fascinating and good read as well.
Oh, thanks so much. I really enjoyed it, and I'm happy to come back anytime you'll have me.
Absolutely. Professor Yoo, you take care, be well, and thanks for your time today. Best of luck with the book.
Thank you.
Once again, John Yoo joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner. And I definitely, this is the kind of discussion we need to have, is what really is the role of the presidency? And in what ways is President Trump actually in excess of the authority given under the Constitution? And to what extent is that excess that he is in, is that a result of Congress, not just President Trump unilaterally saying, hey, I'm going to do this? Because believe it or not, despite his rhetoric, he's not. In most of these cases, going in a way that has not been authorized by Congress. I think in some cases wrongly. I think the border wall, a national emergency declaration, I don't think it should be applied there. But it looks like statutorily, the law is something that can be applied in that particular circumstance. I don't think that the president should be unilaterally able to implement tariffs on China in the way that he did, but Congress gave him the authority. I think the Defense Production Act is unconstitutional, where the president can basically commandeer private companies and say, hey, you're going to create PPE or this and that. I think that the way that statute is structured is against the Constitution, but hey, it is the law of the land giving him that authority because of Congress, and the Supreme Court hasn't ruled that unconstitutional. Therefore, a president could go ahead and use that authority because Congress has given it to him. It is a fascinating discussion. Again, the book Defender in Chief worth checking out. Thanks for watching this clip of Jimmy at the Crossroads. Don't miss more engaging, intelligent talk. Subscribe today to the Jimmy at the Crossroads YouTube channel. You do not want to miss our live show. Thanks for your support.
I got Jimmy at the Crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah.